Good afternoon again. Let me just have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we pray that you'll be with our minds and help us as we seek to think your thoughts after you. Guide us so that we can understand. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, here's what we're going to try to do in this presentation. We're going to look at the Adventist view of the nature of Christ from our beginnings until the 1950s. We're going to consider how to best interpret Ellen White's writings. We're going to review the Bible teaching on the nature of Christ. We're going to look at Ellen White's main published statements about this. We're going to offer a solution to this that should help those who are interested in demystifying the Christology of Ellen White. Christology is a term simply addressing what inspired writers say about Jesus and the combination of his divinity with his humanity. Normally we talk about it often using the phrase, the nature of Christ. I believe you've also been given some handouts, and we might want to put the link for those that might be live streaming. We have a couple of handouts. You here have the color handout here from the Baker letter. Okay, we want to pass those out right now, and here I see them coming. Now, if you're looking, we have a few other things that you're probably not going to receive, but if you go to the website, deerparkadventist.org, and click on Pastor's Notes in the upper right corner, you can download this. This is the manuscript release 1002, the Ellen White Estate, the release of the entire Baker letter, front to back. You don't get this if you go to 7 BC Bible Commentary where they're quoting it. This is the whole thing. And we're going to number it based on the paragraphs in the manuscript release numbering. So 13.1 is page 13, paragraph 1. 18.1 is page 18, paragraph 1, and so on. There's another document you could download if your printer hasn't melted yet, and that is, we have an item called, hanging there, sample statements on the early church fathers on the teaching of adoptionism. So you can download that if you want. There's time if you're at your computer. Well, let's carry on here. We said what we're going to do. We've got your handouts coming to you now. And so we've bit off another large piece here, but it won't be quite as severe as the last one. From the earliest published statements of Seventh-day Adventists as a people until the publication, 72 years later, of Ellen White's private 1895 letter to William L.H. Baker in 1957, the Church offered essentially one understanding on the nature of Christ. Now, evidence for this is abundant, and if we just had a couple of hours, we could wade through it all. But if you have these books on your shelf, and if you don't, try to get them. But this is The Word Was Made Flesh by Ralph Larson, who really has got some powerful information for you. I believe this is out of print, and Amazon wants 3 digits if you want to get it. But if you have one, it's very valuable. The Word Was Made Flesh, and he studies 100 years of Adventist Christology, 1852 to 1952. That is a pretty interesting volume if you have it. And then we have J.R. Zurcher. This came out of not that many years ago. Touched with Our Feelings. Again, he goes through systematically through the history. And if you want to know what Adventists taught for a century, it's all laid out here in black and white. It couldn't be any more clear. And these books are twin brothers. There's a few other pieces in the back that's very helpful. But anyway, if you have these, grab them. And if you don't, try to grab them again. They are very valuable. Oh yeah, those fell out. I was thinking of using these before. I have a picture and you won't see it there. But my parents had a 1957 Chevy Bel Air. And somebody backed into it and dented. I was going to use it for an illustration here. But it seemed like it was a confusing illustration. But you know what? I will use it as an illustration. When they bought this car, my dad really wanted it. So this was 19. There's still milk jugs on the porch because for a couple of years they had the milk coming. But they bought this car and it wouldn't get over Mount Hood, so they sold it. So be careful about things that are from 1957. But that's kind of impromptu. All right, let's carry on with this. So until 1957 and the publication of the Baker letter, the Adventist approach was to speak of the nature of Christ from the Bible passages in Romans, Philippians, and Hebrews, the same ones we've looked at all these years, and that's what early Adventists used to do. There had been no piling up of sets of Ellen White quotations posed in competition to each other. Before the 1950s, the view held by the Seventh-day Adventist Church was that Jesus took the nature of Adam after Adam had sinned. That is, when he came, Jesus had taken a post-fall or after the fall humanity, damaged and sin-impacted as yours and mine is. Jesus took a fallen nature. For the first century of Adventism, almost 99.9% without exception, this is what Seventh-day Adventists as a people, the whole church, taught. That's an important piece of fact for you in case it didn't register. That's an important piece of fact. 100 years of that. In 1957, excerpts from Ellen White's private 1895 letter were included in the back of QOD in the Appendix B about Jesus in this compilation of Ellen White quotations. Now, the appendix was misleading, unfortunately. Headings were provided in some cases exactly contradicting the statements that were presented in those quotations. Key statements were kept out of the compilation. So that's one way to deal with evidence. If you don't like the evidence, suppress it. And in QOD, some of the evidence is not in QOD. The evidence was not presented. The statements were provided, that were provided were italicized in a heavy-handed way to support a preferred emphasis. In some cases, you have these 3 and 4 dots, what I call the bullet holes, you know, ellipses where you have a quotation and then that dot, 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 and you always kind of wonder, why are those bullet holes there? Because a lot of times it's because sometimes it's just something that wasn't useful, but sometimes it's something that wasn't liked, so they shoot it. But these are some of the ways that quotations were used in the appendix in Questions on Doctrine. So another thing is that the Baker letter is chopped into pieces and it's repeated 2 or 3 times. This looks like it's from several different documents, but it's one document. But they've used the 7 SDABC commentary paging, and so it looked like they were getting several documents from Ellen White that say the same thing. No, it was one document. So this is, on the basis of these quotations, presented, unfortunately, in a misleading setting. A modification of the Adventist view of Jesus was set forth in Questions on Doctrine. Now, as Seventh-day Adventists, we are committed to the truth of God. It doesn't matter what the truth is. We want to find it. We want to absorb it. We want to be changed by it. We want to follow it. And if it doesn't mesh with what we believed before, oh well, let's follow Jesus. That's the Adventist approach. So whatever however uncomfortable it makes us, whatever the teaching on the nature of Jesus is, thank you, Lord. I will go there. The proper response to God is always, yes, sir. So when we find out what his teaching on the nature of Christ is, yes, sir. Let's teach it and move on. So we're committed to that. If it's different than we thought, let's change our view. If it confirms what we thought, we are just as zealous and maybe even more zealous and vigorous to teach that truth that God gave us. Why wouldn't we be? God gave it. He delivered it. We need to give the message. And so we want to lay hold on it and run with it. So how do we understand what inspired writings say about, for example, our concrete topic today, the nature of Christ? We use what we call hermeneutics, this big theological word, and I'm throwing a few big theological words today. Sorry for that, but they're there. So hermeneutics is what that is, very simply, is principles of interpretation, rule or methods of interpretation. I'd like to share 5 or 6, just very quickly here, just to set us up, 5 or 6 basic interpretative rules for how we interpret inspired writings. This is going to be good for the Bible. This is going to be good also for the writings, other writings that are inspired, the writings of Ellen White. So here's one. I think you know all these pretty much. Gather up all the inspired data on a question and then consider weight of evidence. Usually most of the passages are going to lean to one understanding. There might be 1 or 2 or 3 that seem like they don't match. But if you study them more closely, you almost always see how they fit exactly with the weight of evidence, all the other passages. 96 statements here, 2 statements there. And you study it further and say, oh, well, they're all in harmony. They're all like the 96, more or less. You see how that works? So gather up all the inspired data, go by the weight of evidence. Number 2, determine the meaning of sentences and short quotations by carefully considering them in context, in the paragraphs and the longer passages where the author presented them. So don't go and just grab a little slice. Don't do that. Look at it in the paragraph that it is. Look at it in the longer section, maybe in a chapter. Look at it in the book. Look at it in the broader section. Don't just cut little pieces out. That usually doesn't end well. Number 3, Let clearer passages guide in the interpretation of less clear passages. This makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Let clearer passages guide when you're interpreting less clear passages. When you come to something strange, when we come to 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul talks about baptism for the dead, do we build a doctrine of baptism for the dead? No, we look at the clearer statements that talk about baptism. And that's the way to interpret Scripture. So that clearer statements guide in the interpretation of less clear passages. Number 4, the author's intended meaning has to be the starting point. Not what I want it to mean, not what you want it to mean, not what 16 scholars over here say. What did the author mean? We have to start there and try to grasp what the author is actually saying. Number 5, the chair passages should lead in explanation. Chair passages tell us the most in one place about a topic. So the idea comes from the idea of a teacher sitting in a chair and teaching his or her class. So chair passages are the passages that lead in the teaching of a particular idea. Examples. The chair passage on the millennium. Where would you find those? Revelation chapter 20. Chair passage in the Bible about the law. Why don't you use Exodus chapter 20? The chair passage on the third angel's message. It's in the book of Revelation. What chapter is that? 14. That's a chair passage. And so you can see how this works. Chair passages contain the largest amount of material in one place on the respective doctrines. Number 6, consider the genre. The genre. Different kinds of inspired material function differently. The Adventist Church wouldn't be what it was if we were blind about genre, okay? Narrative, like Genesis, is to be interpreted very literally, all right? The earth was created in 6 about 24-hour literal days, right? But when you go to apocalyptic, like Daniel and Revelation, what do you do with days? A lot of times there you'll find a day equals a year. So there's a lot of things that are figurative there. So a day might represent a year, a star represents a church, a beast represents a nation. Apocalyptic prophecy is a different genre, so we interpret it differently than we do narrative. So this is important when we think about genre. That's an important piece of the picture. Listen to this. If I send a text message to my wife, Pamela, I'm coming home from church board. I'm leaving the church meeting and I text her, hey, I'm on my way home. So I send a text message to her and she texts me back and says, honey, stop at the store and buy some bananas. So I text her back, okay, bang, and I stop at the store and I buy bananas. Now, in the text message it doesn't say, and when you come home, come back to our address, 320 South Margaret Avenue. It doesn't say that because you know what? She and I share some information in common. We both know I'm on my way home from church board. We both know I'm headed for home. And so she doesn't have to tell me the address. I know the address anyway. So that is shared information. So if you read our text message, you might say, well, where was he going? He's going home. Well, where does he live? We don't know. My wife knows, and I know. You don't know. Well, now you do. But it's because it's a private text message is it's a separate kind of a genre. It's a type of writing. It's a kind of writing. So we need to consider the genre when we're interpreting things. What's interesting about this is that Ellen White has two kinds of writings. She has published writings, which Desire of Ages on your shelf is a good example of that. And she has unpublished writings, such as this Baker letter. There was a private letter written to William Baker in 1895. Those are different kinds of genres, and that's going to be important to us as we go on here. More on this genre question, epistles. 1 Corinthians is called an epistle, but an epistle is more of an open letter. It's like a circular letter. If you wrote a letter to somebody and you put it on the internet and 100,000 people can read it, that's open. But if you have something like 3 John or Philemon, those are personal letters from the inspired writer, Paul, in Philemon, in regards to that. And in 3 John, there's a letter there involving John. It's a personal letter back and forth. So we have those. It's equally inspired, but there might be some information that they have that we don't have. So it's harder to interpret something when we are lacking some of that extra data. Like the banana illustration a minute ago, okay? So there's different genres. What about this letter that I mentioned of Ellen White to William Baker? And I think you hopefully now have your handout with all of the color sprayed all over it. So this is our handout, and we've just taken the key paragraphs in the Baker letter, 18 Page 18-1, paragraph 1 and 2. Page 19, 1, 2, and 3 are the paragraphs, and a couple of other things. So this is a little piece from the Baker letter, and we're going to be looking at this because Ellen White's letter to William Baker was a private letter, and we don't have very much context. All we have really is the internal context. If you downloaded the entire Baker letter, you've got a lot more just by seeing everything that she wrote. It's a fantastic letter. It's got a lot of good counsel, and so I'd encourage everybody to read it. But we won't have time for that today. But before we plow into that again, let me come back, and what I want to do is take just a brief time with you and talk with you about the Bible teaching on the nature of Christ. Because ultimately, you see, Ellen White's view is ultimately informed by the same thing that informs you and me. What does the Bible say about Jesus in His humanity? Does that make sense? So we want to think about this. What is this that Ellen White was looking at? So we're just going to zoom through this real quick. A few things. You've probably thought of these before or know them, but the Bible is abundant in both content that is implicit and explicit about Jesus and His humanity. So let's go. In Exodus 3, verse 2, Jesus presents Himself as a lowly burning bush. That's significant. In Exodus 21, verse 8, He's prefigured by a serpent on a pole. At Deuteronomy 18, verse 5, Moses prophesies of Jesus as a prophet like himself who will arise from among human brothers. In Psalm 8, man is described in his enormous creation dignity, crowned by his Creator with glory and honor. And in Hebrews 2, later in the Bible, shows that there's a piece of that has to do with Jesus. Isaiah 53, verse 2, Jesus is prophesied to come as a root out of dry ground. Same chapter, verses 4 and 11, He's wounded with our stripes, He carries our griefs, sorrows and sicknesses, and the punishment He receives provides healing for you and I. In the Gospels, Jesus is referred to as the Son of Man. Do you know how many times? More than 80 times. That's significant. Because, see, there's never been a Son of Man that didn't have a fallen nature. Think about it. Matthew 30 times, Mark 15 times, Luke 25 times, Gospel of John 12 times. There's a few more later in the New Testament. Jesus, the Son of Man, His favorite self-designation, He called Himself the Son of Man. It's significant. But the Gospels really are only the beginning. Romans 1:3 tells us that Jesus was the seed of David. And in the 8th chapter of Romans, that Jesus came in the likeness of sinful flesh. In Philippians 2, verses 5 to 13, Paul pleads for readers to have the mind of Christ. He points to Jesus emptying Himself, coming in the likeness of men, and keeping in the will of God while in human flesh. In Hebrews 2, 5 to 18, Jesus emphatically takes the same kind of humanity as all other fallen men. As a seed of Abraham, He's made like His brethren in all things. In Hebrews 4, verses 14, 15, and 16, Jesus is described by the inspired writer as tempted in all things like as we are. The Bible evidence, it's substantial, it's dramatic, it's emphatic, and it's clear. Now, a lot of this information I've been giving you in my talks is very informational, and there's not very much regular preaching, so let's look at Hebrews 2, and we'll talk a little bit more about Hebrews 2 before we keep moving. I'd like to just sample this, just for maybe 4 minutes with you, sample closely at least this one scripture passage about Jesus that we love. Hebrews chapter 2. In larger context, you look at the first 7 chapters of Hebrews, they present Jesus as what? The ultimate revelation of God. The atonement is discussed. Jesus is compared to angels, to Moses, and to the Levitical priesthood. The necessity of diligence is repeatedly highlighted. We heard some of that this morning. The most striking material closely connects Jesus' humanity with atonement and with overcoming. Mentioned it last time, they are always connected. The humanity of Jesus and the atonement of Jesus, they're connected. So let's look, starting at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5. Jesus' mission of atonement is here described. Paul's writing about the world to come, earth in the future. This planet was placed in subjection to humans. The 8th Psalm is cited there by Paul as he's writing through here in Hebrews. What's it describe? The creation dignity of humans. Only a little lower than the angels, man was crowned with glory and honor. Man was placed over the creation. But all things are not subject to him yet. Our writer is referencing the sin problem, the rebellion of Lucifer, his enticement of man, and man's subsequent fall. When Adam sinned, death was introduced. To restore his creation, Jesus comes in the same kind of damaged humanity and tastes death for every man. He makes atonement. The humanity of those who need redemption and the humanity of the one who would redeem us is explicitly linked all through this passage. Look at verse 7, verse 9, Hebrews chapter 2. Next we come to verses 10 through 13, Hebrews chapter 2. It is fitting for the Father, in bringing many sons to glory, to send Jesus to experience with humans the travails of humanity. Quote, "For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one." From one what? From one common humanity. Jesus is not ashamed to call us His brethren. Jesus isn't ashamed to call you His brother, His sister. I love it. Paul's not ashamed of the gospel. And Jesus isn't ashamed to say, "This is my son, this is my daughter." God is bringing His people together. Next, we're going through Hebrews chapter 2. The author of Hebrews cites Psalm 22. You know Psalm 22, Jesus dying on the cross, kind of a prophecy before that. It foretells the sufferings of Jesus and His death on the cross. But Psalm 22 has two pieces. The first part where he's saying, why have you forsaken me? But the last part is his victory cry. There's two sections in this psalm. And in Hebrews, what is it quoted? It's quoted from the victory cry. He rejoices that His sacrifice has been accepted. The particulars of sacrifice are carefully specified in the Bible. The sacrifice must be innocent, it must be appropriate for the offerer. Since Jesus was a sacrifice for us, for fallen humans, He must bear our flesh in common with us. At the same time, He cannot sin. And this exactly describes the sacrifice of Jesus. The next passage quoted in Hebrews 2 is drawn from Isaiah chapter 8. You know that chapter. To the law and to the testimony, verse 20. Go back a little bit. In Hebrews chapter 8, Isaiah describes his own mission, and he reminds us that he and his children were set aside to be signs and wonders in Israel. Were we in these last days set aside to be signs and wonders? Is God planning to do a miracle in your life that will tell something to the universe about the loving character of our God? You need to believe that. God gave their names, prophetic names, and their significance. And that is mentioned in Isaiah. The author of Hebrews uses this connection to Isaiah with his children and his children with Israel as a parallel to Jesus' connection with Israel. The work of the Messiah is a connecting work, intimately linking God and humanity. At verse 14, we're in Hebrews chapter 2, we see the necessity of Jesus, our high priest, sharing our kind of humanity. The Bible writer says, "Since the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise also partook of the same." It was necessary for Jesus to die in order to neutralize the power of Satan and to free us, slaves to death. Here is a subtle reference to Egypt, to Moses, to the Passover. Jesus is like Moses, delivering the people, and at the same time, He's like the Passover sacrifice. He's the ultimate, actual sacrifice. But it goes on, Jesus doesn't help angels. That's kind of sad. Jesus should help the angels, shouldn't He? But who are the ones that need help? Fallen people, you and I, we need the help. Jesus comes to help us. And so what do we see? Jesus, since the children share in flesh and blood, Jesus takes the same thing. Jesus' humiliation rips even lower. He doesn't come as an angel or like an angel. He comes to help the seed of Abraham, and that's you and I. Again, the necessity of being made like His brethren in all things is put in emphasis. You'd have to be blind not to see it in Hebrews chapter 2. You'd have to be not listening to miss this. Verse 18, "Since He Himself was tempted in that which He has suffered, He is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted." Are you tempted? Jesus is able to come to your aid and mine. And in 4:15 of Hebrews, Jesus is able to sympathize with our weaknesses for the very reason that He has been tempted in all things like as we are. The Bible would be very different without these extraordinary statements about Jesus who came down from heaven and took a humanity like you and I to redeem us. What then can we say? Hebrews 2 certainly stands out among the hermeneutical seats of doctrine passages, doesn't it? Here we are granted significant revelation concerning Jesus humanity in relation to His making of atonement for His people. It's all here in Hebrews 2. And this was just a short sample. Jesus, our great high priest, took a humanity like ours because that was the kind of humanity that needed redeeming. Our kind of humanity, exactly our kind, that was the kind for which Jesus' example of overcoming was essential. Our Father gave Him to us as the ultimate template example, Jesus. Do you want to know how to live for God? Look to Jesus. Do you want to know how to overcome? Look to Jesus. How do you advance in your walk with God? Look to Jesus. He's the author and finisher of your faith. But now let's turn from the Bible to Ellen White's view on the nature of Christ, and the view also of early Adventists. It was fundamentally determined by the text we just looked at, and it's a continuation of that Bible teaching. The passages informing her were the same we just looked at: Romans 8, Hebrews 2, Philippians 2, Hebrews 4. If you want to get Ellen White's understanding on the topic, we will need to follow the same hermeneutical plan we use for Scripture. Namely, we look at all that she wrote about the topic, and similar to the Bible, it's given in various ways. There's different kinds of writing. Ellen White prepares some material for wide publication and a general readership. Other times she's writing a private letter to an individual dealing with particular points known especially to her and the recipient. All of her writings we consider to be inspired, but at the same time we have one group we call her published writings and another group that are private, unpublished letters. Let's start with Ellen White's published statements. So I'm going to go through these now and look at Ellen White's primary published content. Where do we find Ellen White's primary published content on the nature of Christ? Tell me. The Desire of Ages. So let's take a few minutes and we're just going to read these out. You know these already, but I'm going to start on page 49 of Desire of Ages. There's a reason why we're looking at this. Her published writings are going to help guide us. Clear passages help us with less clear passages. Desire of Ages, page 49. It would have been an almost infinite humiliation for the Son of God to take man's nature, even when Adam stood in his innocence in Eden. But Jesus accepted humanity when the race had been weakened by 4,000 years of sin. Like every child of Adam, He accepted the results of the working of the great law of heredity. What these results were is shown in the history of His earthly ancestors. He came with such a heredity to share our sorrows and temptations and to give us the example of a sinless life. And further down on page 49, into the world where Satan claimed dominion, God permitted His Son to come, a helpless babe, subject to the weakness of humanity. He permitted Him to meet life's perils in common with every human soul. Listen, to fight the battle as every child of humanity must fight it, at the risk of eternal failure and eternal loss. Desire of Ages 1:17, and again, several lines. Satan had pointed to Adam's sin as proof that God's law was unjust and could not be obeyed. In our humanity, there it is again, Christ was to redeem Adam's failure. But when Adam was assailed by the tempter, none of the effects of sin were upon him. He stood in the strength of perfect manhood, possessing the full vigor of mind and body. He was surrounded with the glories of Eden and was in daily communion with heavenly beings. It was not thus with Jesus when He entered the wilderness to cope with Satan. For 4,000 years the race had been decreasing in physical strength, in mental power, and in moral worth. And Christ took upon Him the infirmities of degenerate humanity. Only thus could He rescue man from the lowest depths of his degradation. Many claim that it was impossible for Christ to be overcome by temptation. Then He could not have been placed in Adam's position. He could not have gained the victory that Adam failed to gain. If we have in any sense a more trying conflict than had Christ, I'm going to underline that. If we have in any sense a more trying conflict than had Christ, then He would not be able to succor us. But our Savior took humanity with all its liabilities. He took the nature of man with the possibility of yielding to temptation. We have nothing to bear that He has not endured. Just later on the page, just where the ruin began, the work of our redemption must begin. And as by the indulgence of appetite Adam fell, so by the denial of appetite Christ must overcome. Further down the page, 117 still, Desire of Ages. From the time of Adam to that of Christ, self-indulgence had increased the power of the appetites and passions until they had almost unlimited control. Thus men had become debased and diseased, and of themselves it was impossible for them to overcome. In man's behalf, Christ conquered by enduring the severest test. For our sake, He exercised a self-control stronger than hunger or death. Desire of Ages, page 336. When Jesus was awakened to meet the storm, he was in perfect peace. There was no trace of fear in word or look, for no fear was in his heart. But he rested not in possession of almighty power. It was not as master of earth and sea and sky that he reposed in quiet. That power he had laid down. And he says, I can of mine own self do nothing, John 5:30. He trusted in the Father's might. It was in faith in God's love and care that Jesus rested. And the power of that word which stilled the storm was the power of God. And we could even add more than this, couldn't we? But a sample. These paragraphs distill the essence of Ellen White's rounded, carefully presented, inspired, intended for all readers, public presentation of her views on the nature of Christ. Clearer passages guide in the interpretation of less clear. Is this getting complicated yet, or are we pretty simple so far? Notice, Jesus accepted humanity after the race had been weakened for thousands of years. He fought the battle, it said, as every child of humanity must fight it. Are you and I, are we included in every child of humanity? Jesus fought the battle the same way we must fight the battle. So each one of you are part of every child of humanity. How do we do it? In undamaged flesh or damaged flesh? In fallen flesh or unfallen flesh? In what kind of humanity was Jesus to redeem Adam's failure? It said it repeatedly, quote, in our humanity, unquote. Jesus took on him that kind of humanity that could save man, it said, from the lowest depths of degradation. And there are people, I'm certain, in the hearing of my voice, and you think about your experience before you came to Jesus, and you know that Jesus saved you from the lowest depths of degradation. It's precious to you that Jesus did that. It's precious to you that Jesus took a humanity so that he could do that for you and for me. We have nothing to bear that he has not endured. He conquered by enduring the severest test. Do you see that any one of these statements really solves the problem? We can stop filming right here. Any one of these statements solves the problem. It tells us exactly what kind of humanity Jesus took. Combined, they are overwhelming in their clarity. And remember that these are her published statements, her most careful, for broad readership presented statements. But let's talk about an unpublished statement. I'd like to look with you at the Baker letter, and you have the handout. There's more than just the Baker letter, but time only permits us to look at a little bit of this. So who was William Baker? And basically all the things we're going to say at this point are, almost all of it is built off of internal evidence in the entire Baker document, which you can download. We gave you the link. Who was William L.H. Baker? I'll just summarize it for you. A church worker in America, then Australia, then New Zealand, and then finally back to America. His career in order included Adventist printing and publishing. Then he was an evangelist. Then he was an administrator. Then he was a college Bible teacher, taught at Avondale for a while. Lastly, he was a chaplain. From Ellen White's 1895 letter to him, we can further infer that he was on the bookish side. He liked books. Is there anybody here that likes books? Yeah, I was going to say don't raise your hand, but it's too late. My wife knows also that my hand has to go up there. More the reader than the preacher, Baker was. He had personal tendencies toward melancholy and discouragement. And he was more inclined to follow than to lead. As for Tasmania, you know, it's the largest island, I believe, immediately south of Western Australia. Population today, about 600,000. About a dozen Seventh-day Adventist churches today, maybe 1,100 members. Tasmania, where L.H. Baker worked. Well, what does the Baker letter say? Ellen White saw the Bakers were in a state of discouragement, and we're looking at the entire Baker letter for a moment here. She sought to bring encouragement to them. They were engaged in difficult ministry. They were trying to come close to families. William was more used to work at the press than in evangelistic field work, and he preferred the study of books to arguing with settlers and convicts. There was a lot of settlers and convicts there. His melancholy nature made this probably the most difficult years in his life work. He'd rather sit with a book than be out knocking on doors or doing Bible studies. Some of us had that experience. I see Mr. Strever looking at me. But I don't know if Danny likes knocking on doors. That's why your life was coal porter. A lot of that. Must like knocking on doors. But Baker wasn't like Danny Strever. Well, listen, this melancholy nature is here. Ellen White is coming, and she's telling him he needs to engage more aggressively in personal labor and more aggressively in preaching. She admonishes him not to devote great time and attention to the study of the writings of the fathers, to speculative questions, or to the traditions of men. She says, go out there and do some evangelistic work. That's your present work, brother. Ellen White, counseling William Baker. Depend less on the counsel of distant leaders and just go and do your work. But our attention really has to focus on a few key paragraphs, and so now we're looking at the handout at last. All right? So what we've done is put it here on a handout, paragraph from the Baker letter, 18.1, 18.2, 18.3 in the left column. The warning section, more or less the second column, we're going from left to right. The body content, the main part in the middle. And just some random notes over here and Bible texts that are being referred to. So also in the Baker letter here, or on the handout, yellow refers to humanity. The lines that are highlighted in green reference the divinity and humanity in combination. Orange background on your handout, it puts the phrases concerning the propensities. That's all page 18, paragraph 1. Blue background represents action of the will. Bold print represents temptation. And so this way you can find some of these things quickly in the letter. So on this page you have, it doesn't have it, but in the long version, the entire letter, on page 22, paragraph 3, there's an interesting statement. I'll read it to you. Ellen White to William Baker. The popular opinion of what saith the fathers will not help my case. My work is given me of God to know and understand His will for my individual self, and so on. You need to study for yourself and do your own labor. But it's an interesting line. The popular opinion of what saith the fathers. That's an interesting piece of information. What is that talking about? What saith the fathers? Well, I have here some quotations from something called the Fathers. Now, the Fathers, here we go. The early church fathers don't register with us because we're not into big on tradition like that. But the early church fathers were different theologians and pastors and bishops that in the early years of the church wrote things, and they were preserved. If you want to get it and download it on your iPhone, I hope you've got a lot of memory. 16 million words in 37 volumes. It takes the fastest readers years to read the Fathers. The Fathers. It appears that William Baker was reading from the Fathers. You could waste a lot of evangelistic time reading the Fathers. It's like when I was colporteuring, and I always hoped that started with a door, and the first door that I always went to a house, it looked like there was nobody there. And that was my first door. But after that I was fine, but the first door was the hard one. So I think William Baker could relate to that. He'd go pick the door that looked like nobody was home. Usually God put someone in that house, and they were right there when I got there. God loves it. So we have the Baker letter, and we're talking about the writings of the early fathers. So there's a teaching that the early fathers had. It's called the teaching of adoptionism. Adoptionism, it's the idea that Jesus had a beginning, and He did not always exist, but then He was joined to the Godhead and became part of God. So He kind of got promoted from being maybe a mere man, or not even that, then He was a man, and then He became God. And I have here in this handout that you can get if you really want it, some of the writings of the Fathers, maybe some that Baker had read. I'll quote just a few. I won't quote from Shepherd of Hermas, Theodotus, from Hippolytus. I'll skip that. Paul of Samosata. But let me give you a couple of these from Paul. For in fixity and resoluteness of character he likened himself to God, and having kept himself free from sin was united with God. That's how Jesus became God. He was a good guy, and God said, yeah, come up and be part of the team. Here's another one. He succeeded in perfecting himself and was through his moral excellence united with God. Here's another one from Arius. The Logos is only called Logos conceptually and is not Son of God by nature and in truth, but is merely called Son, he too by adoption as a creature. Here's another one. If the Father begat the Son, he was begotten and had a beginning of existence. And from this it is evident that there was a time when the Son was not. Here's another one. We are persecuted because we say that the Son has a beginning, but that God is without beginning. Just a sample. There's more, but this is a sample. Sample statements from the early fathers on adoptionism. You know what the main question in adoptionism is? It's always the when question. When did humanity blend with divinity? Inevitably, that's the question with this topic. When did humanity blend with divinity? Do you know that that's the very question? Look at your handout. That's the very question when Ellen White asks, is it 19:1? Listen to some of this. The last part on the page. The incarnation of Christ has ever been and will ever remain a mystery. I'm in the middle of 19:1. That which is revealed is for us and for our children, but let every human being warn from the ground of making Christ altogether human, such an one as ourselves, for it cannot be the exact time when humanity blended with divinity. It is not necessary for us to know. We are to keep our feet on the rock, Christ Jesus, as God revealed in humanity. The very questions that are adoptionist questions, those are the very ones that Ellen White says, don't study the fathers, and then she answers the question right here. We can't make one Jesus altogether such a one as ourselves. And there are forms of adoptionism where Jesus could have sinned before he kind of upgraded. He could have sinned, and then when he began to be holy, and God said, come and become part of the Trinity, part of the Godhead. So it seems like this is one of probably the best theory we have about what's being talked about in this Baker letter. It's an unpublished letter. We don't have any context hardly except the internal evidence. But here is some internal evidence that matches historical evidence that looks very interesting to us. The first one that came with this theory was Ralph Larson. And in fact, it's in the back of this book. The Word was made flesh. He's already nailed this. We didn't have to hold this. Danny, we could have just read this book. I believe in standing on the shoulders of giants. Ralph Larson was a giant. Well, if Baker was dabbling in these questions about adoptionism, then Ellen White's concerns written to him and the content of the argumentation there falls right into place. So that's a key thing that's going on. If you look at this handout, you see that her main emphasis, look at her handout. You have the warning column and you have the main content column, roughly. So she gives a warning about Jesus' humanity, again and again. But then the main thing she talks about is, look, she talks about that Jesus is a blend of divinity and humanity. Warning, divinity and humanity. Warning, divinity and humanity. If you are dabbling with adoptionism and thinking that maybe Jesus had a beginning and he wasn't God, then what do you have? You want to find out the answer about this mix between... Ellen White needs to come and punch it home. Hey, this is a blend. Jesus is a blend of humanity and divinity. He's not just human. He's human and divine. And so in the Baker letter, this is exactly the course that Ellen White takes in her discussion with Baker. Very interesting. Perhaps really a piece of the answer on this. So if you look at these things, what do you find? We've kind of got them in the different columns, the warning, but then the main idea. She's focusing on this blending of divinity and humanity. She keeps commenting that Jesus never yielded. He never responded. He never stepped on Satan's ground. If Baker is entertaining the thought, or even, God forbid, if Baker's teaching that Jesus was a man who became God rather than God who became man, then writing to Baker, emphasizing Jesus' divinity and humanity combined, is a perfect fit. And by the way, when Ellen White writes a letter to somebody and she's inspired, don't you think she's going to hit it right on the head? She's going to hit that nail right on the head because the Holy Spirit is showing her exactly what needs to be addressed. Ellen White, dealing with this question, telling this young worker, get back to work. You can sit and read your book, but go knock on the first door. And so it all makes good sense. But there's another question about we find in the Baker letter, and it has to do with this word propensities. In paragraph 18.1, you'll see the three references there in your handout sheet. Paragraph 18.1, they're all in orange. The warning, do not set him before the people as a man with the propensities of sin. The inherent propensities of disobedience are what Adam's posterity is born with in the body content, and then also in the middle, there was not for one moment in him, in Jesus, an evil propensity. What do we do with all that? Well, propensities. A lot of people make a big issue out of this. But notice that we're dealing with a preposition here. propensities, it says, of sin. Was Jesus a man with propensities of sin? Of signifies from. Of always means connected to and from here. So, did Jesus ever make decisions that stemmed from sin in himself? No. Was there ever an evil propensity in him? Did he ever nurture a propensity? Like once you've sinned, then after that it's easy, right, to sin? It's way easier to sin. Jesus, did he ever step across the line? Did he ever transgress and then it was easy for Jesus? Of course not. There was never an evil propensity in Jesus. And so making Christ altogether such a one as ourselves, that's not the issue here. Blending of divinity and humanity combined. Then these propensity issues come up. What kind of humanity did Jesus have? And we come and make a big deal of this question about propensities. Propensity just means tendency. Did Jesus have a tendency from sin? No, he didn't. He never sinned. In fact, look at the blue on your handout. Notice that the blue has to do with the action of the will. Talking about Adam here in 18:1, he could fall, and he did fall through transgressing. How did Adam fall? He fell through transgressing. He made a choice. Down in 19:1, don't leave the idea that attainer or inclination of corruption rested upon Christ, or that in blue, that he in any way, what? The verb is yielded. Did he in any way yield to corruption? No, he didn't. And so these don't really fit for Jesus, that he would be having these propensities in a way that he is joined to sin. Look on 19:3, if you flip your page over. The first Adam fell, the second Adam held fast to God and his word under the most trying circumstances. Ellen White compares Jesus and Adam in the wilderness a couple of times here in 18:1 and then in 19:3. It's a very interesting comparison if you look at it. But notice the blue here at the bottom of 19:3. Hereafter I will not talk much with you, for the prince of this world cometh and hath nothing in me, nothing to respond to temptation. Not one occasion has been given in response to his manifold temptations. Not once did Christ step on Satan's ground to give him any advantage. Satan found nothing in him to encourage his advances. Again and again, Ellen White's talking about the decisions that Jesus made or didn't make, or made not to go that way. You know what's interesting here is that the Baker letter comes in what year? 1895. When was the Desire of Ages published? 1898. And I want you to look at the last part of your handout. Because in Desire of Ages, pages 122 and 123, it appears, there's quite an interesting parallel here. It appears that Ellen White took the statement she made in the Baker letter and expanded it. And that's what found its way into being her published writings in Desire of Ages. Look, you'll see the same pieces. She talks about Jesus in the wilderness, Baker letter. Desire of Ages, Jesus in the wilderness. She quotes John 14:30. Desire of Ages, she quotes John 14:30. And the other pieces are very similar too. But I want you to hear what she says here in Desire of Ages. Starting in the three in the middle of the back side of the page. In our own strength, it is impossible for us to deny the clamors of our fallen nature. Through this channel, Satan will bring temptation upon us. Christ knew that the enemy would come to every human being to take advantage of hereditary weakness, and by his false insinuations to ensnare all whose trust is not in God. And by passing over the ground which man must travel, our Lord has prepared the way for us to overcome. Let him who is struggling against the power of appetite look to the Savior in the wilderness of temptation. See him in his agony upon the cross as he exclaimed, I thirst. He has endured all that it is possible for us to bear. His victory is ours. Now here it comes. 123.3. The prince of this world cometh, said Jesus, and hath nothing in me. John 14:30. Now what does she say next? There was in him, in Jesus, nothing that what? Nothing that responded to Satan's sophistry. What's the next word? He did not consent to sin. Do you see that? Not even by a thought did he yield to temptation. And then those next 5 words there, 6 words, so it may be with us. I almost want to sing them. So it may be with us. We could make a tune out of that. And we can say more, but the clock's going to get me. So, I believe Ellen White expanded her talk in the Baker that it was in the Baker letter. She expanded it and put it in Desire of Ages. She left out the part about the fathers because people reading Desire of Ages would not have been interested in that. So here we have all of White's published writings. We're looking at this one in particular, unpublished statement. So let's just tie off this. Unlike the Baker letter, we have little information about the details in the Baker letter, but with Desire of Ages, you have the crown jewel of Ellen White's published writings about Jesus. If we want to know Ellen White's inspired view concerning the humanity of Christ, the Desire of Ages is the clearest, most intentional material available. Like published writings in general, informational gaps are much smaller because the author and publishers provided the reader with carefully prepared material. The Baker letter was quickly written, it was a private letter, it was inspired, but it was written against the backdrop of mutually shared information. We don't have some of that information. We're doing our best with the internal evidence, and that's where we come with the adoptionist theory. The author and the recipient could take a shortcut with each other, just as you and I take a shortcut with a friend or a family member or a text message. That's how it works. Ellen White's writings offer a very clear view that Jesus took the nature of Adam after the fall. Now, some are probably watching and asking, why haven't we said more about the propensities? There's a fundamental premise. Inspired writings always agree with inspired writings. Ellen White's writings are going to agree with Ellen White's writings. So, friends, we need to look broadly at the Ellen White writings, and we're going to see they all pretty much agree. To conclude, in 1957, the promoters of the new theology taught in Questions on Doctrine set forth certain excerpts from a private letter that had lain in the files for 72 years gathering dust. I'm glad they found that letter because it's inspired and I wanted to read it. But then a particular interpretation of White's letter to William Baker was suddenly thrust forward and made determinative for a new way of thinking about the nature of Christ and the church. This was bad hermeneutics. The change could only be accomplished at the cost of ignoring not only the straightforward testimony of Scripture, but a century of Seventh-day Adventist teaching that Jesus had taken fallen human nature, and by ignoring some and radically reinterpreting other of Ellen White's statements. When we consider the teaching of Adventism on the nature of Christ until the 1950s, and when we review White's published writings on the topic, the answers are clear. A careful reading of the private Baker letter, honoring its place side by side with her published writings, shows that the Baker letter to be in harmony with the other material. It was not obscurity on White's part that led to confusion. It was hermeneutical malpractice by the authors of Questions on Doctrine. Seventh-day Adventists stand free today to lay aside QOD's slanted interpretation of the Baker letter and understand it in a way that lines up easily with the weight of evidence in the Bible and the published writings of Ellen White. Clearer passages help us understand less clear passages. Care in interpretation helps God's church and demystifies Ellen White's Christology. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, thank you for the writings of the Bible. Thank you for the writings of Ellen White. Thank you for the Baker letter. And thank you that the message, overall message of these writings is very clear. Thank you that you gave Jesus for us. In Jesus' name, amen.